If Ukraine still had nuclear weapons today, Europe would be living one miscalculation away from catastrophe. Fact 1. If Ukraine had never given up the Soviet nuclear arsenal on its soil, the first big change is simple. Russia would have treated Ukraine as a far more dangerous state from the very beginning. Ukraine inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal after the Soviet collapse, but it did not have full independent operational control at first, which means keeping those weapons would have required a long, risky, expensive struggle to seize real control and build a national command system. That process alone could have triggered an earlier Kremlin confrontation, possibly in the 1990s rather than decades later. Fact 2. There is also a hard truth many people skip. Keeping the arsenal would not have meant instant safety. A nuclear force only deters if it is usable, secure, and politically credible. Ukraine would have needed launch authority, maintenance chains, warhead stewardship, delivery system modernization, and protection against sabotage or preemption. That would have cost enormous sums while the country was already fighting economic collapse after independence. So yes, a retained arsenal might have scared Moscow more. But it also could have made Ukraine poorer, more unstable, and far more vulnerable during the dangerous years when its state institutions were still being built. Fact 3. On the positive side, the argument many Americans instantly understand is deterrence. Nuclear weapons change the price of aggression. A Ukraine with a survivable nuclear deterrent might have made the Kremlin think twice about Crimea in 2014, and certainly about a full-scale invasion later. Even a small chance of nuclear escalation can freeze military plans in the heads of generals and presidents. That is the brutal logic of the nuclear age. But deterrence is never magic. It can stop wars, yet it can also tempt both sides into constant brinkmanship, where one bad signal or one false alarm changes history in minutes. Fact 4. The global cost would have been enormous. If Ukraine had kept nuclear weapons, it likely would have faced intense pressure for violating the post-Cold War non-proliferation order instead of joining the non-proliferation treaty as a non-nuclear state. That could have meant less Western trust, fewer aid packages tied to denuclearization, and a much weaker moral position later when asking the world to defend its sovereignty. In other words, Ukraine might have gained fear, but lost sympathy. And in international politics, fear can delay an attack, while sympathy is what brings sanctions, weapons shipments, money, and allies to your side. Fact 5. If Ukraine had kept nuclear weapons, relations with the United States would have been far more complicated and far less trusting. In the 1990s, Washington strongly pushed for denuclearization to prevent the spread of nuclear states after the Soviet collapse. A nuclear Ukraine might have been seen not as a partner, but as a proliferation risk. That could have reduced economic aid, delayed integration with Western institutions, and limited intelligence sharing. Over time, this might have left Ukraine more isolated, forced to rely on its own deterrent rather than building the deep political and military partnerships that later proved critical. Fact 6. At the same time, a nuclear Ukraine could have changed NATO's entire strategy in Eastern Europe. Instead of expanding security guarantees and cooperation, NATO might have kept greater distance to avoid entanglement with a new nuclear state outside its control. This would have reshaped the security architecture of Europe. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states might have accelerated their own defences even more, fearing both Russia and an unpredictable nuclear-armed neighbour. The region could have become less stable overall, with multiple states preparing for worst-case scenarios rather than building coordinated defence systems. Fact 7. One of the most dangerous possibilities is internal instability. Nuclear weapons require strict control, discipline, and political cohesion. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Ukraine faced corruption, political infighting, and economic crisis. Maintaining a secure nuclear arsenal under those conditions would have been extremely difficult. The risk of accidents, unauthorized access, or even black market leakage of nuclear materials would have been a constant concern for the entire world. Instead of being seen as a victim later, Ukraine might have been viewed as a global security risk, changing how other nations reacted to its struggles. Fact 8. But there is a powerful counter-argument that continues to resonate, especially today. Nuclear weapons might have prevented large-scale war altogether. If Ukraine had a credible second strike capability, meaning it could respond even after being attacked, any invasion plan would carry unacceptable risk for Russia. Leaders calculate survival first, Even a small nuclear exchange would have catastrophic consequences for both sides and for Europe. This fear alone might have frozen the conflict before it escalated. Yet this also means Europe would be living under constant tension. Peace not built on trust, but on the permanent threat of mutual destruction. Fact 9. If Ukraine had remained a nuclear state, the entire concept of security guarantees would look very different today. The Budapest Memorandum, which promised respect for Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for disarmament, would never have existed in its current form. That means there would be no long-standing argument about whether the West failed Ukraine. Instead, the debate would shift. Should countries rely on international promises or only on their own weapons? For many Americans, this would hit directly at the credibility of global agreements, raising uncomfortable questions about whether diplomacy without force is ever truly reliable. Fact 10. A nuclear Ukraine could have triggered a chain reaction far beyond Europe. Other countries watching in the 1990s, especially those with security concerns, might have concluded that giving up nuclear weapons is a strategic mistake. Nations like Iran or North Korea could point to Ukraine as proof that keeping nuclear arms ensures survival. This would weaken the entire global non-proliferation system. The result is not just one additional nuclear state, but potentially several more over time, increasing the chances of nuclear crises in multiple regions simultaneously. Fact 11. Economically, maintaining a nuclear arsenal would have been a long-term burden that most people underestimate. Warheads require constant maintenance, secure storage, and modernization to remain credible. Delivery systems such as missiles and bombers would need upgrades or replacements. For a country already facing economic hardship after independence, these costs could have diverted resources from infrastructure, energy independence, and social stability. Over decades, this might have slowed Ukraine's development, making it less resilient internally, even if it appeared stronger militarily on the surface. Fact 12. On the other hand, nuclear status often brings a different kind of international attention, not always negative. Ukraine might have been treated as a major strategic power rather than a regional one. Its voice in global security discussions could have carried more weight, forcing other nations to engage with it more seriously. This could have translated into different negotiation dynamics with both Russia and the West. However, this influence would come with a cost. Every political crisis, every leadership change would be watched through the lens of nuclear risk. Fact 13. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is how close the world might have come to nuclear escalation during real crises. Events like the annexation of Crimea or the full-scale invasion could have unfolded very differently if both sides had nuclear capabilities directly facing each other. Military miscalculations, false intelligence, or rapid escalation could have created moments where leaders had only minutes to decide. For an American audience, this raises a chilling thought. Conflicts that feel distant today could have carried immediate global consequences, potentially involving NATO and drawing the United States into a nuclear standoff. Fact 14. If Ukraine had nuclear weapons, crisis communication between Kiev, Moscow and Washington would become far more urgent and fragile. Direct hotlines, constant intelligence monitoring, and rapid response diplomacy would be necessary to avoid accidental escalation. Every military movement, even routine exercises, could be misinterpreted as preparation for a nuclear strike. This means that during moments of tension, decisions would be made faster, under pressure, and with incomplete information. For Americans, this raises a serious concern. The margin for error in global security would shrink dramatically, where one misunderstanding could trigger consequences no leader could reverse. Fact 15. A nuclear Ukraine might also have influenced domestic politics in ways that are difficult to ignore. Control over nuclear weapons often strengthens executive power because decisions must be fast and centralized. This could have shifted the balance inside Ukraine's political system, especially during periods of instability. In moments of crisis, democratic processes might have been bypassed in the name of national security. While this could improve response speed, it also risks concentrating too much authority in too few hands, something that Americans historically view with caution when nuclear decisions are involved. Fact 16. Another overlooked consequence is how Russia's military doctrine might have evolved in response. Facing a nuclear-armed Ukraine on its border, Moscow could have adopted a more aggressive preemptive strategy, including lowering the threshold for using its own nuclear weapons. This would not stabilize the situation, it would make it more dangerous. Instead of preventing conflict entirely, both sides might prepare for rapid escalation scenarios. For the United States and NATO, this creates a nightmare scenario, a regional conflict that could turn nuclear not after months, but within hours. Fact 17. Energy and economic pressure would likely look very different in this scenario. Russia has historically used energy exports as leverage, but that strategy might have been less effective against a nuclear-armed Ukraine. At the same time, Western countries might hesitate to impose strong economic measures during crises, fearing escalation with a nuclear state. This could weaken the effectiveness of sanctions as a tool of international pressure. For Americans, this presents a difficult trade-off. Would economic tools still matter, or would nuclear deterrence overshadow every other form of influence? Fact 18. Finally, the psychological impact cannot be ignored. A nuclear Ukraine would permanently change how ordinary people in Europe and beyond perceive security. Instead of viewing conflict as something that can be contained, the fear of escalation would always be present in the background. This affects markets, politics, and public opinion. In the United States, every crisis in Eastern Europe could feel more immediate, more dangerous, and harder to ignore. The question becomes deeply personal. Are nuclear weapons a guarantee of safety, or a constant reminder that peace depends on decisions made in seconds? Fact 19. If Ukraine had retained nuclear weapons, the question of command and control would become one of the most critical and dangerous issues. Nuclear systems require absolute clarity. Who gives the order, under what conditions, and how it is verified. In times of political instability or leadership transition, this chain could be tested. For the United States, which has spent decades refining strict nuclear protocols, the idea of a newer system under pressure raises serious concern. A single breakdown, technical or human, could create confusion at the worst possible moment. Fact 20. There is also the issue of intelligence and surveillance. A nuclear Ukraine would be under constant observation by both allies and adversaries. American satellites, Russian intelligence, and other global powers would closely monitor its arsenal, movements, and readiness levels. This creates a high-pressure environment where secrecy is difficult and misinterpretation is common. Even defensive actions, such as moving weapons for safety, could be seen as preparation for use. For Americans, this reinforces a key fear. In the nuclear world, perception can be just as dangerous as reality. Fact 21. A nuclear-armed Ukraine might have complicated European unity in response to crises. Some countries would strongly support Ukraine as a deterrent against Russia, while others might fear being drawn into a nuclear confrontation. This division could weaken collective decision-making within alliances like the European Union and NATO. For the United States, which relies on allied cohesion, this presents a serious strategic challenge. Instead of a unified response, there could be hesitation, disagreement, and delay. Exactly the conditions that make conflicts harder to control. Fact 22. At the same time, Ukraine's military strategy would likely be very different. With nuclear deterrence as a backbone, conventional forces might be structured more defensively, focusing on protecting key assets rather than projecting power. This could reduce the likelihood of prolonged conventional wars, but increase reliance on nuclear signaling during crises. For American military planners, this creates a difficult scenario. How do you support an ally whose ultimate defense rests on weapons that cannot realistically be used without global consequences? Fact 23. Another critical factor is technological sustainability. Nuclear weapons are not static. They require ongoing scientific expertise, testing simulations, and infrastructure. Ukraine would need to maintain a highly skilled workforce and secure facilities over decades. Economic hardship or political instability could threaten this system. For Americans, this raises a familiar concern. What happens when nuclear capabilities outlast the stability of the institutions managing them? The risk is not just external conflict, but gradual internal degradation of safety and reliability. Fact 24. Finally, the presence of nuclear weapons could have changed how the current war, or any conflict, is reported and perceived globally. Media coverage, public opinion, and political messaging would all be shaped by the constant possibility of escalation. In the United States, every headline involving Ukraine could carry an implicit nuclear warning, influencing voters, policymakers, and markets. This would not just be a regional issue. It would feel like a direct national security concern. The emotional weight alone could reshape how Americans think about foreign conflicts and intervention. Fact 25. If Ukraine had nuclear weapons, the concept of military aid from the United States would look very different. Washington is far more cautious when dealing with nuclear-armed states outside formal alliances. Supplying advanced weapons, intelligence, or direct support during conflict could risk escalation in unpredictable ways. This means Ukraine might have received less conventional military assistance, especially during active crises. For Americans, this creates a difficult dilemma. Is it safer to support a non-nuclear partner more openly, or a nuclear-armed state more carefully? The answer is not obvious, and the consequences would shape every decision. Fact 26. A nuclear Ukraine could have changed how Russia calculates not just invasion, but pressure tactics over decades. Instead of large-scale military actions, Moscow might rely more heavily on cyber warfare, political interference, and economic destabilization. These methods avoid triggering nuclear escalation while still weakening the state. For the United States, this shifts the battlefield into areas that are harder to deter and harder to respond to. It becomes less about tanks and borders, and more about influence, infrastructure, and long-term erosion of stability. Fact 27. Another serious consequence is how crisis escalation timelines would compress. In a conventional conflict, leaders may have days or weeks to assess and respond. In a nuclear scenario, that window can shrink to minutes. Ukraine retaining nuclear weapons would mean that any major confrontation with Russia could escalate rapidly, leaving little room for diplomacy once events begin. For Americans, this is deeply unsettling. Decisions that could affect global survival might be made faster than most people can process the news. Fact 28. At the same time, nuclear weapons might have reduced the likelihood of prolonged war on Ukrainian territory. If both sides understand that escalation carries unacceptable risks, they may avoid sustained ground conflict altogether. This could mean fewer destroyed cities and fewer long-term humanitarian crises. However, the trade-off is constant high-level tension instead of open war. For American audiences, this raises a critical question. Is a frozen conflict under nuclear threat better than an active war without it? Fact 29. The legal and diplomatic standing of Ukraine would also shift significantly. As a nuclear state outside the established nuclear powers, Ukraine would face ongoing scrutiny in international law and arms control negotiations. It might be excluded from certain agreements or pressured into new ones under less favourable conditions. For the United States, which plays a central role in shaping global rules, this creates a more complex environment. Supporting Ukraine diplomatically would require balancing non-proliferation principles with strategic interests. Fact 30. Perhaps the most uncomfortable reality is how this scenario would reshape American public opinion itself. A nuclear Ukraine changes how distant conflicts are perceived. Instead of being seen as regional or strategic, every escalation would carry the implicit risk of nuclear involvement. This could divide Americans more sharply, between those who argue for strong support to deter aggression and those who fear being pulled into a nuclear confrontation. The debate would not just be political, it would be existential, forcing people to confront how close global security really is. Fact 31. If Ukraine had remained nuclear, the credibility of US security assurances worldwide would be judged very differently today. Many countries rely on American guarantees instead of building their own nuclear deterrence. If Ukraine had kept its arsenal and avoided conflict, others might conclude that nuclear weapons, not alliances, are the ultimate protection. For Americans, this creates a serious strategic risk. Allies may begin questioning whether promises are enough. Over time, this could weaken US influence globally as more nations consider independent nuclear capabilities rather than relying on Washington. Fact 32. A nuclear Ukraine would likely force the United States to maintain a much higher level of constant military readiness in Europe. Strategic bombers, missile defences and nuclear forces would need to remain on heightened alert to monitor and respond to any escalation. This is not just a military issue, it is economic and psychological. Sustaining that level of readiness over decades is costly and exhausting. For Americans, this means more resources dedicated to deterrence abroad, and a постоянное чувство, что глобальная безопасность никогда не может быть taken for granted. Fact 33. Another critical consequence is the risk of nuclear miscalculation during limited conflicts. Even a small clash, a border incident, a drone strike, or a naval encounter could escalate rapidly if both sides fear losing control. In such situations, leaders might feel pressure to act decisively before the other side does. This creates a dangerous use it or lose it mentality. For the United States, this is one of the most feared scenarios in nuclear strategy. Escalation not because of intention, but because of fear and uncertainty in fast-moving crises. Fact 34. At the same time, Ukraine's internal identity and global image might be fundamentally different. Instead of being seen primarily as a country defending its sovereignty, it could also be viewed as a nuclear power whose actions carry global consequences. This changes how every decision is interpreted. For Americans, this would complicate public support. Some would see Ukraine as a necessary deterrent force, while others might feel uneasy about backing a nuclear-armed state in an active conflict. The emotional clarity of supporting a victim becomes far less simple. Fact 35. The most powerful and difficult question remains unresolved. Would nuclear weapons have truly guaranteed Ukraine's safety, or simply raised the stakes of every crisis to an unimaginable level? Deterrence can prevent war, but it cannot eliminate risk. It transforms it. For Americans, this scenario forces a direct confrontation with reality. Security built on nuclear weapons is not stability, it is balance under pressure. And when that balance depends on human decisions, the margin for error is never zero. Would nuclear weapons save Ukraine, or bring the world closer to irreversible disaster? What do you think?